Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. In this week, we will feature a two-part episode about the Stayner family's worst nightmare. One son, a kidnapping victim and a hero; another son, a serial killer. This video will be part 1 about Steven Stayner, who at 7 years old, got kidnapped but eventually managed to escape after 7 long years. This is Horrifying Story. Viewer discretion is advised. The Stayner family lived in a remote farming town of Merced, California, just nearby the famous Yosemite National Park. Steven was the third of 5 children of Delbert and Kay. His elder brother was named Carrie, which we'll feature on our next video, and he also had 3 other sisters. Delbert was a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army for 4 years. He served the country until 1957, and eventually married Kay sometime in 1960. It was on December 4, 1972, in Merced, California, an innocent and unsuspecting Steven Stayner was walking home from school when a man named Irvin Murphy came toward the 7-year-old boy. He was pretending to distribute some religious tracts and began talking to the boy about a charity donation drive. Steven, thinking his mom would be interested in donating, engaged in the conversation with Irvin until eventually, he was talked into getting into their car for a ride home. Driving the car was Kenneth Parnell, an ex-convict pedophile, who turned out to have manipulated Irvin into thinking that his calling was to be a religious mentor to a young boy. Instead of dropping the second grader off at the Stayner residence, Kenneth drove to a far-off cabin in Cathy's Valley and began brainwashing Steven to think that his parents no longer wanted him. Steven was made to believe that his parents have given him off to Kenneth as his legal guardian. Kenneth went on to change the name of Steven to Dennis Parnell, giving the boy a new identity as his own son. Kenneth decided to retain the boy's original birth date and fearlessly, even sending him to school during those years. By day, Kenneth posed as Steven's father, but behind the walls of their cabin, he became Steven's living nightmare. From the very first night of his abduction, Steven endured relentless sexual abuse, a torment that continued for the entire 7 years of his captivity. The psychological damage inflicted on Steven was so severe that despite having the freedom to leave the cabin whenever he wanted, he never tried to escape. He was often left alone for hours, with no one to stop him from walking out, yet the idea of fleeing never crossed his mind. Kenneth had only issued a single warning, but that threat was so deeply ingrained in Steven's psyche that it kept him paralyzed, unable to act on his own behalf. The control Kenneth had over him was absolute, until something shifted. It wasn't until other children became involved, threatened with the same horrors Steven had endured, that the instinct to protect overcame his crippling fear, and he realized that remaining passive was no longer an option. When Steven reached his adolescent years, Kenneth Parnell sought out for younger boys. He first got his friend, Barbara Mathias, who was also believed to have taken part in abusing Steven, to do the kidnapping. When their first attempt failed, Kenneth coerced Steven to do the job. Steven, who was now a 14-year-old lad, deliberately failed quite a few times. In his desperate efforts, Kenneth then proceeded to bribe Sean Porman, one of Steven's friends. Later on, Sean tried to call off the plan, but after receiving threats from Kenneth, eventually obliged. Not long after, on February 14, 1980, in Ukiah, California, Kenneth had his eyes on a 5-year-old boy and ordered Porman to lure the boy into getting in the car. The boy refused and ran towards his house, but Porman caught up to him. The boy tried to hold onto a chain fence, however, Porman was able to pry the boy's fingers from the fence and was able to get him inside Kenneth's car. Despite the commotion, nobody saw or heard him scream. Kenneth sped off and brought the boy to his cabin. Steven gained a newfound brother, the 5-year-old Timothy White. Kenneth then changed Timothy's name to Tommy and dyed the boy's hair brown. Kenneth proceeded to tell the same lies he told Steven in the past to brainwash him. Because Steven could no longer stand with the thought of having another innocent boy suffer like he did, Steven gathered enough courage to run away with Timothy. Deep into the night, while Kenneth was working on night shift, the two boys sneaked out of the cabin and walked miles until they reached the main highway where they were able to hitchhike a ride. His initial plan was only to return Timothy to his parents, but after failing to find his home, he brought themselves to the police station. Steven then told Timothy to go in and tell the police his name and they will return him home. Timothy started to walk towards the entrance of the police station but then was too scared that he ran back to Steven. Steven had no choice but to go in with Timothy so the boy could get back to his parents. It was early morning of March 2, 1980, just 2 weeks after Timothy was captured. Steven confirmed his identity to the officers. "I know my first name is Steven. I'm pretty sure my last name is Stayner, and if I have a middle name, I don't know it." These were the very words he uttered to the police, and he began to recount his horrifying experience. Because the Stayners continued to publicize Steven's disappearance, it wasn't hard for the police to identify Steven as well, so they were both kept in custody. That evening, a joyful reunion filled the homes of both families, much more for the Stayner household who got their miracle. For 7 long and grueling years, they hung on to the hope. As Delbert said, he never stopped looking. In every TV or magazine, he had always hoped he could spot Steven in the crowd. And their tireless efforts proved to be worth it. Steven's brave act, after all the years that he had to endure, made headlines all over the country. News spread like wildfire, and Steven went from being known as the 7-year-old innocent victim to being honored as the courageous hero. Meanwhile, Kenneth went to trial and faced charges for the kidnappings of both Timothy White and Steven Stayner. To the shock of many, he was sentenced to only 7 years in prison, an outcome that fell far short of expectations given the gravity of the 2 kidnapping cases. Even more disheartening, Kenneth was released on parole after serving just 5 years. Despite his brief incarceration, he gradually returned to his old predatory habits. In 2004, he was caught attempting to purchase a 4-year-old child online. This time, justice was more severe, and Kenneth was sentenced to 25 years to life. In 2008, at the age of 76, Kenneth died in his prison cell while serving his sentence. Irvin Murphy also spent only a mere 2 years in prison, despite being sentenced to 5 years. While Sean Porman, Steven's friend, served in a correctional institution for minors. Sadly, Barbara Mathias never paid for her participation in the crime. Timothy White, on the other hand, was able to smoothly recover from the trauma. He graciously forgave his kidnapper, Sean Porman, whom he believed was also a victim of Kenneth's manipulation. Timothy married and had 2 kids. He became a deputy sheriff and strongly campaigned against child sexual abuse and even participated in the final arrest of Kenneth. Throughout the years that his personal hero was alive, Timothy and Steven remained close. Unlike Timothy, Steven's recovery was far more difficult. After being held captive for 7 long years, returning to his family required a major adjustment for everyone involved. His parents still treated him as though he were the 7-year-old boy who had disappeared, unable to reconcile the child they lost with the young man who returned. His siblings, having grown up in his absence, struggled to reconnect with him. The intense media attention also weighed heavily on Steven. Everyone knew his story and the abuse he had endured, and this notoriety made him a target for bullying at school. The constant ridicule and inability to escape his past eventually led him to drop out, compounding the emotional burden of his return. Steven got used to the carefree life he lived as Dennis Parnell. He drank and smoked all he wanted and did everything he wanted to do, so free that subjecting himself to the authority of his biological parents was a culture shock for him. To the point that he even wondered if things would have been better for everyone if he didn't show up again. Life seemed to go downhill for Steven until he started his own family. He met 17-year-old Jody Edmondson and they married in 1985. They had 2 children, Ashley and Steven Jr. He began to volunteer for groups that supported children who had been through the same traumatic experience. In 1989, as if his personal life hadn't been overexposed, the media wasn't done with him just yet. A mini-series of his life entitled, I Know My First Name is Steven, was released on NBC, and a book was later published by its writer, Mike Eccles, with the same title in 1991. Tragically, Steven didn't live to see his children grow up. He died at the young age of 24 when he was met with a fatal accident on his motorcycle as he was returning from work. It was September 16, 1989, just 4 months after the series was first released. Timothy White, who was still 14 years old then, came to escort Steven's coffin at his funeral. Timothy also died young in 2010, at the age of 35, due to pulmonary embolism. Tragedy didn't end with Steven's death. The Stayner family had been consumed by Steven's abduction, his miraculous escape, and his difficult road to recovery. Their lives became so centered around Steven's trauma and survival that they failed to notice the fractures forming within their own family. In focusing all their energy on Steven, they overlooked the need to care for each other and themselves. This neglect left them blindsided by what would come next, Carrie Stayner's unraveling and the shocking events that followed. Thank you so much for making it this far. We hope to see you on our next video, where we cover the second part of the Stayner's family ordeal. Please click on the like button and subscribe to our channel for more horrifying stories. We are grateful for your support. Once again, thank you, and we'll see you next time.